Paul's time in Jerusalem had gone just as badly as everybody feared it would. We recall that time after time, Paul's friends tried to persuade him to avoid Jerusalem, just stay away. But Paul insisted. This was a trip he needed to take. He knew it might end poorly, but he was willing to die in Jerusalem if that was what was required. So, now Paul is in Jerusalem. And let's recap some of the highlights of his time here. First, Paul is asked by the Jerusalem church to try to win over the Jewish Christians by taking part in a vow that 4 men were participating in. Hopefully, that would convince the people that he'd not abandoned his Jewish ways, and Paul agreed. However, when Paul was around the temple, some Jews spotted him and falsely accused him of bringing a Gentile into the temple in Jerusalem. So because of that, Paul was attacked in the temple courts. And had the Roman soldiers not intervened, the mob probably would have killed him. Lysias, the Roman commander, can't figure out what has the Jewish people so angry with Paul. Then Paul asks to speak to the angry crowd, but they get all riled up again. So Lysias decides to have Paul flogged, a method used to force a confession. But right before being flogged, Paul reveals he is a Roman citizen, and that changes everything. Whereas before, he was treated as a peasant troublemaker, now he's treated with respect. Lysias decides to have Paul appear before the Sanhedrin in order to figure out what are the charges against him. However, the Sanhedrin get into a big argument over whether the bodily resurrection of people is true. So Lysias takes Paul back to the fortress of Antonia for protection. And that brings us up to where we are today. We see our story beginning in Acts 23, beginning in verse 12. The next morning, some Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. More than 40 men were involved in this plot. They went to the chief priests and the elders and said, "We have taken a solemn oath not to eat anything until we have killed Paul. Now then, you and the Sanhedrin petition the commander to bring him before you on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about his case. We are ready to kill him before he gets here." But when the son of Paul's sister heard of this plot, he went into the barracks and told Paul. Then Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the commander. He has something to tell him." So he took him to the commander. The centurion said, "Paul, the prisoner, sent for me and asked me to bring this young man to you because he has something to tell you." The commander took the young man by the hand, drew him aside, and asked, "What is it you want to tell me?" He said, "Some Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul before the Sanhedrin tomorrow on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about him. Don't give in to them, because more than 40 of them are waiting in ambush for him. They have taken an oath not to eat or drink until they have killed him. They are ready now, waiting for your consent to their request." The commander dismissed the young man with this warning: "Don't tell anyone that you have reported this to me." So Paul's enemies devise a plan to kill him. And over 40 men went to the elders and chief priests to involve them in the plan. The Sanhedrin was to tell Lysias, the Roman commander, that they have a few more questions for Paul and request that he send Paul to them for a special session. But on the way between the fortress and the council chamber, the 40 men would ambush Paul and kill him. It is interesting that these guys went to the high priestly aristocracy and the elders. These would all be Sadducees. The scribes, who would be Pharisees, aren't mentioned. The meeting the day before involving Paul before the Sanhedrin didn't go well. It blew up as a huge argument exploded between the Sadducees and the Pharisees concerning the resurrection. The Pharisees somewhat sided with Paul, so now they're left out of the plot to kill him for obvious reasons. The 40 men are so serious about killing Paul that they've taken an oath concerning it. And the word translated oath is actually a curse. So their oath was that they would starve to death unless they fulfill their vow to kill Paul. Well, that's some pretty serious stuff. Of course, there was a means of escape if for some reason they couldn't fulfill their oath. The Jewish law would simply require them to bring atonement offerings to the temple. So they're serious about killing Paul, but in the end, they probably wouldn't really starve to death if for some reason they weren't able to kill him. Well, somehow, Paul's nephew hears of the plot. Now, the mention of Paul's sister and nephew is interesting because other than these few verses, we don't know anything about Paul's family living in Jerusalem. We do know that Paul's nephew is a young man because the Greek word used to describe him means a young man under the age of 40. He's probably somewhere in his late teens. We also don't know how he received this information about the plot to kill Paul. But people talk. And over 40 people were involved in the plan. And the plan is then shared with most of the Sanhedrin members. So now probably about 100 people are involved in the plan. Some of these people, they'll tell their wives. Some may go out and brag about how Paul's going to get what he deserves to their friends. However it happened, somehow the information sifted down to Paul's family, and now they're in the know. So Paul's nephew goes to the barracks to tell Paul about the plot. Kind of makes us wonder, doesn't it? How is it that this young man could simply go to the barracks and speak to the prisoner? Well, this is one of the perks of having Roman citizenship. Citizens were often allowed to have friends and family just visit freely. And also, in Paul's confinement in Jerusalem, he's not kept in some dark inner cell and chained to the floor by leg irons as he had been in Philippi. This is a more honorable custody. It's more like a minimum security prison. Plus, Paul seems to be in very good standing with the Romans. And we see an indication of this in what Paul does next. He tells one of the centurions to take his nephew to the commander because he has something to tell him. And the centurion completely complies with his request without any attitude or any questions asked. The centurion is not really a low-ranking soldier. He's a man in charge of 100 other soldiers. And Paul doesn't tell the centurion what the secret may be, but the centurion simply grants Paul's request. And then, consider what Lysias, the commander, did. Evidently told that this was Paul's nephew and he had something to tell him, Lysias takes him aside so they can have a confidential meeting. Lysias knows that this young man was sent by Paul, and he's treating with extreme importance. So now, obviously, Paul's being treated with some serious respect. So Paul's nephew tells Lysias of the plot against Paul, and Lysias tells him to keep it under his hat. Lysias needs to act to protect Paul, and he doesn't want the word to get out that he's wise to their plan. We pick it up in verse 23. Then he called 2 of his centurions and ordered them, "Get ready a detachment of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at 9 tonight. Provide horses for Paul, so that he may be taken safely to Governor Felix." He wrote a letter as follows: Claudius Lysias, to His Excellency, Governor Felix. Greetings. This man was seized by the Jews, and they were about to kill him. But I came with my troops and rescued him, for I had learned that he is a Roman citizen. I wanted to know why they were accusing him, so I brought him to their Sanhedrin. I found the accusation had to do with questions about their law, but there was no charge against him that deserved death or imprisonment. When I was informed of a plot to be carried out against the man, I sent him to you at once. I also ordered his accusers to present to you their case against him. So the soldiers carrying out their orders took Paul with them during the night and brought him as far as Antipatris. The next day they let the cavalry go on with him while they returned to the barracks. When the cavalry arrived in Caesarea, they delivered the letter to the governor and handed Paul over to him. The governor read the letter and asked what province he was from. Learning that he was from Cilicia, he said, "I will hear your case when your accusers get here." Then he ordered that Paul be kept under guard in Herod's palace. So Lysias devised a plan of his own to get Paul safely out of town. First, he got 470 soldiers ready to safely transport Paul from Jerusalem to Caesarea. Well, this was nearly half the soldiers that were stationed in Jerusalem. That's a lot of soldiers. Nearly 500 soldiers to guard one man. The idea was to present overwhelming force so that the 40 or so men who came to attack and kill Paul would immediately see it was just a hopeless cause and just give up. We know the 40 men were determined. They'd taken an oath. They'd gotten the backing of the chief priests and elders. And they knew the reality that to challenge even a few Roman soldiers meant that some of them would die. But they were willing for a few of them to be sacrificed if it resulted in Paul's death. But no way did they expect 470 soldiers. When they realized they were up against 470 highly trained Roman soldiers, they knew that not only would they not get to Paul, they would all die in the attempt. Well, second, Lysias planned to usher Paul out of town under the cloak of darkness at 9 o'clock p.m. Lysias wasn't going to wait around a few days. He acted very quickly. Paul would be moved that very night. Obviously, the fact that he acted quickly and moved Paul at night indicates that Lysias took the threat of the ambush very seriously. Lysias sent Paul to Felix, the governor over Judea. And as governor, Felix held the same position that Pilate held about 30 years earlier. Now, Felix was not a good governor. First, he got the job by connections, not by merit. His brother, Apollos, had a lot of influence with the Emperor Claudius. And both brothers were freedmen of the imperial family. In other words, they used to be slaves for the emperor, but now were granted Roman citizenship. It was highly unusual for a former slave to become a Roman governor. But that just kind of goes to show what can happen with well-placed connections. Felix governed at a difficult time. He had to deal with the rising tide of Jewish nationalism and many revolts, and he brutally suppressed them all. He didn't concern himself too much with consistency or fairness, totally lacking understanding or sympathy for the Jews. And the way Felix ruled Judea made the Jews even more anti-Roman. Lysias sent along a letter to inform Felix of the situation. A letter was required when transferring a prisoner from one jurisdiction to another. The letter would tell the charge against the prisoner as well as details about the crime that was committed. Lysias starts his letter with a white lie that makes him look good. He tells Felix that the Jews attacked Paul, but that he rescued Paul from them because he learned he was a Roman citizen. Well, that's kind of sort of true. But the reality is that Lysias had Paul strapped to the whipping block and was ready to flog him. And it's only at that moment that he discovered that Paul was a Roman citizen. So he really didn't have Paul's best interest in mind at first. He thought he was some kind of a criminal or troublemaker. Lysias completely leaves out the flogging part of the story in his letter to Felix. Lysias then writes that Paul's issues have nothing to do with Roman law. It's something he did regarding Jewish law that offended the Jewish people. Lysias is still somewhat in the dark regarding exactly what it is that Paul did to upset the people so much. He certainly doesn't see that Paul has done anything deserving death or even imprisonment. But the Sanhedrin and the Jewish people, they want him executed. Lysias' job in Jerusalem is to be a keeper of the peace. He's not authorized to rule on cases that call for capital punishment. So he's referred the case now to Felix, because Felix does have the authority to rule in cases such as these. Lysias also told Felix that he informed Paul's accusers to get a case together against Paul that they could present before Felix. The 470 soldiers took Paul to Antipatris. Antipatris was a military station fortified by Herod the Great and named for his father Antipater. It marked the border between Judea and Samaria and was about halfway between Jerusalem to Caesarea, where they're eventually going to make it, so a good place to stop for the night. The terrain from Jerusalem to Lydda, which was about 7 miles before Antipatris, was difficult and would provide plenty of cover for an ambush party. But once the troops made it to Antipatris, there was far less danger, and so most of the soldiers could just go back to Jerusalem. The Jewish historian Josephus tells us that troops were able and they were trained to undertake all-night marches when necessary. They exercised every day, taking these long marches of 20 miles at 4 miles per hour. So for the troops to travel about 40 miles to Antipatris, they'd have to march all night at a rather fast pace. The good thing for them is the travel was all downhill. Well, the following day, the cavalry accompanied Paul to Caesarea and handed him off to Felix. And Felix received Paul and read the letter. He asked Paul what province he was from, and that was to determine whether or not he had jurisdiction over the case. And once he decided that he did, he told Paul that he would hear his case once his accusers arrived. In the meantime, Paul would stay in Herod's palace under guard. This was a palace originally built by Herod the Great. Herod had built a remarkable port at Caesarea and built an extravagant palace there as well. It now served as the governor's official headquarters. Now, Paul staying in a palace is not to suggest that he's living a life of luxury. Just as the Antonia fortress had rooms to keep people in custody, so did the palace. Well, that's the story today. What is the takeaway? It is that God is faithful. The Lord had come to Paul in prison and promised him that he would preach the gospel in Rome. But now that promise is being put to the test. 40 angry men and the Jewish religious leaders devised a plan to kill Paul. The 40 men had put themselves under a solemn vow, like a curse, if they didn't do as they said and execute Paul. But God's word would be fulfilled. Paul would be taken safely to Rome, regardless of the determination that some had to kill him. In fact, if these men were true to their vow, they'd have to go a long time without food or water, because it'd be about 10 years before Paul's death in Rome. Paul would go to Rome, the center of the known universe, to proclaim Christ. And there would be difficulty still in getting there, and it didn't happen overnight, but it did happen. We need to remember that God is always faithful to his word. What he chooses to accomplish, he will accomplish. It may not be in our timing. It may not happen without some difficult days. but God's will always prevails. We can count on it.